And I'm noticing the, many familiar names that people haven't seen for quite some time, people overseas and so forth. It's a real pleasure to see some, colleagues who I've known for a while, some collaborators. One of the co-authors is also here. So thanks so much. And I also want to thank the funding that that helped this research. I was very fortunate a few years ago to have collaborated with scholars at the Universidade Federal do Ceará, a federal university in Ceará state, which is in the northeast of Brazil. We helped write a proposal to get me there for overall 3 months spread over 3 years as a visiting professor, the PVE program, and that in turn was supplemented with some other funds. The PVE helped to sponsor Brazilians to come here on J1 visas, including one of the co-authors, Nicole, who collected the data as part of her PhD work, and she recently completed that thesis or dissertation in Brazil. So this has been a quite an interesting journey, and I think it adds to, earlier I think overall I've spent probably 25 years doing field work in Brazil in some way or another, and the interest in wind and renewable power in general has come about in part because of some research I had been doing in Texas on wind farms, and also just as one evolves in a research career. It had become clear in the mid-2000s, or the first part of that decade, that Brazil was becoming a significant global player in terms of installed capacity, and this opportunity to collaborate with Brazilians to advance the knowledge in terms of social dimensions really fell at a wonderful time. So I was able to take advantage of experience in Brazil and of course with colleagues. So I mentioned Nicole, who's one of the co-authors, and Anna Lavoie is also a co-author. I think she's on the call. Adriana Gorayebe is another co-author. So we've been, again, we're working on this for quite some time. And as you can tell from the pictures, I've been really fortunate to be able to visit a lot of wind farms in the northeast of Brazil. And as you can tell from the pictures, these wind farms are located in coastal areas, perhaps where they shouldn't, but that's another story, I suppose. They're in some active dune fields. There are varying levels of kind of friendly coexistence, or a little unfriendly coexistence at sometimes. So there's a couple pictures here showing how tourism is compatible in some ways, right, with the dune buggy and the kind of the day trip boat. There's another image here of from a kind of a low-income rural household that has decided to spend some time creating little knickknacks or souvenirs, modeled on the wind turbine itself, as a way to make a little extra income in what is a difficult place to live. So as I get moving here, let me also, if you're a student who wants maroon-based points, this is for you. If you have no idea what this is, then let's just move on to the kind of overall framing of this, which I'd like to draw your attention to a really fascinating review paper by Veers and others that appeared in Science about a year ago. And for social scientists like me, who was not familiar with some of these challenges in terms of the engineering, the materials, and the systems, this is a really illuminating paper in terms of obviously framing these challenges, and also the specific challenges, which is how hard it is to model the actual flow physics of wind at the particular altitude that the wind turbines are located. And added to that is the problem of the wakes. In other words, the turbulence that is caused as wind moves through a wind farm. And the paper also drew attention to how to some of the aerodynamic assumptions that are, they call questionable, and this is about the kind of the structural dynamics of the wind blades and the as they stand more than 100 meters above the surface. And then finally the systems science. In other words, how is it, what big challenge it is to integrate intermittent power into a grid so that consumers are able to turn on the lights and operate machinery or equipment and go about their productive and leisure activities as they would. So these are some, three really big challenges that we're really grateful for these authors for doing this. But at the same time, it's also the case that there is probably no landscape in the world that looks like this diagram. And I'm sure the authors didn't intend this, of course, but almost everywhere you would want to go to put a wind farm somewhere in the world, onshore or offshore, there is going to be some economic claim, some legal claim, some kind of productive use claim, so that it's really hard to think about kind of these engineering science challenges without understanding the social, land, cultural, economic, legal dimensions that are underneath. And one of the people who responded to this paper, if I can get this slide to advance somewhere. Let's see, it's taking its time. One of the responses to this article was by Jeremy Firestone, who has long studied some of the social dimensions of wind power. And I'll just have a kind of a lengthy excerpt here. Maybe overstated, maybe not, but at least things we're thinking about, right? How these engineering science challenges are important to understand, but we need to think about whether they'll succeed without the social sciences. And he goes on to talk about how we need to understand the relationships that people have with places and landscapes. We need to understand competing uses of land and sea. We need to think about how trust is built or not. We need to think about public participation. And he goes on to conclude, again, a very short response or letter, or I forget exactly what it was, but anyway, it's a published response to the article, emphasizing that without a thorough understanding of the human context, we may fall short of realizing the full potential of wind energy. So I think one can, and I agree with this, and many of my social science colleagues who have studied wind for a while, or were kind of intrigued by this engineering heavy piece, and how well we kind of agree that there is vast kind of vast frontiers, but we also would go back to this diagram that they gave us and say we don't really find that on planet Earth right now, right? We do not find places where you can build wind farms and not have to confront some of these human social challenges. So this slide here, I try to rephrase that question to think about, well, what are the social grand challenges of wind energy science as a way to contribute in a productive way to the to this area, and I think that there are two really important starting points, and one is the land dimension. All right, so this kind of gets back to some very basic points that that we need to think about, things like power density and how much land do we need for wind and solar to operate. So here's some work by Miller and Keith these are empirical measurements based on data from actual wind farms and solar farms, and we have some measures here, a little less than 1 watt per square meter for wind, and quite a bit higher for solar. Of course, for solar you don't have complementary uses, or you could, but it's a little bit of a challenge, just like it is for wind, of course. And notably, the power density declines rather dramatically as the area of the wind farm increases, right? And that's a function of the turbulence and the wake issues as wind moves through. More broadly, I think this kind of thinking should hopefully have us interested in a question that I put on the slide, which is how much land is required? How much land would we need to get to 100% wind, water, and solar? And there is a literature that I cite at the bottom of the slide suggesting the possibility for a global land rush, right? So a group of social scientists have taken some of these measures, and they have studied some of the conflicts emerging to suggest a global land rush, which is something that other scholars have observed with, say, biofuels and other kinds of crops necessary to meet future demand. So the land question. The second one, this is what I'll focus on in this paper, is the host community dimension. That is the people who live nearby wind farms. And for years now, 20 plus, not quite 20 years, but a good 15 or so years in the literature, we've been seeing attention to how to understand acceptance of renewable power. And the literature, I think, is largely coalesced around these three big dimensions: that there is a market acceptance, that you need companies, you need investors, you need the owners of capital to invest in wind and solar, obviously. That there is also a social political acceptance in terms of the policies, in terms of the stakeholders and the policy makers, right? This is not, I think, new, hopefully, to anyone here on this. You know, we understand that we have these important dimensions to get the policies right, to get the investment environment right. And then we also have this third dimension of community acceptance. And again, the literature has largely coalesced around these two big ideas of procedural and distributive justice. And you may be wondering, well, where's NIMBY? Where's distance? And the answer here is that, you know, the literature has left those concepts way behind years ago. Well over a decade ago, we started to see scholarly reports and so forth on how the NIMBY, or the distance as a variable that helps to explain community acceptance or rejection, that started to lose validity years ago, and it is less and less important. So, you know, if we look around at the recent literature from a few years to the present, we tend to see a strong convergence around procedural and distributional justice as far more relevant predictors, or far more important concepts to understand host communities. Even aesthetic and visual seem to have you know, attracted far less attention and kind of explanatory power in the recent literature. This is not to say that the environmental and ecological and visual things are not important. They just seem to be not perceived as important by members of host communities. Again, these are the people who live near wind and solar. I'm not going to try to define near. That's a concept that's, you know, we can what that means and so forth is a, you know, requires a little bit more discussion. But these are the community places near wind farms. It could be a few kilometers, it could be a few hundred meters, right? It's a highly flexible idea. The point here, though, is to understand more deeply what is procedural justice and what is distributional justice as applied to the problem of understanding host community acceptance. So both of these concepts are kind of long-standing and really important concepts in many, many fields in the social sciences. And in this short presentation, I can't get into any, you know, true depth as far as the origin of that and the kind of the justice framework that in turn helps to create this. But I recognize that there is a lot of thinking behind these concepts. But to make them more applicable to the question of wind near host communities, what we think about with procedural justice are measures of how of participation in a decision-making process. So normally this includes things like access to information. So in other words, are people who living in a host community, do they have information about the wind farm proposal, about the wind farm project? What do they think about that information? Is that information trustworthy, or is it flawed and opaque? Right? Are there public hearings? And if so, what type of public hearing? Is there opportunity for people to participate in those public hearings? What kind of transparency is there as far as the whole process? Is this a top-down process where decision-making is highly opaque and people simply are on the receiving end of decisions? Or is there more room for, say, bottom-up participation and influence in decision making? And then, is the process seen as fair, right? Is it even-handed, or is the kind of are the decision makers, are they open to new facts, or are they open to encouraging the inclusion of people in the decision-making process, right? So the notion of fairness. And you might say, well, all of these are highly subjective, and in fact, yeah, there is a deep, strong element of subjectivity, and in terms of what for an investor would constitute a fair process may be very different from what the member of a host community may understand as a fair process. Distributional justice takes us to thinking about how people perceive the costs or harms and the benefits of wind farms. And this again is a multifaceted kind of bundle of things that could begin with ownership. In other words, do community members have the ability to also be part owners in terms of, say, a cooperative or a community-owned wind farm? Right? Do community members have the ability to obtain royalties from the output of the wind turbines? Do they have the opportunity to obtain rents? Do they have, say, reduced electricity tariffs? Is there preference in terms of employment? Right? Will they have a better chance at getting jobs from this? How are the burdens and the discomfort distributed? Right? If people are negatively affected by noise, flicker, and other things, are they also compensated for that? Right? So these are, again, a bundle of pretty complex things that, again, we have known for a while from the work of Wustenhagen and Wolzink and others, that these matter, that these are a critical dimension in the community acceptance. And community acceptance in turn is part of basically a three-tier or a three pillars of understanding or thinking through the acceptance of renewable power. And at the bottom of this box, there is the very simple question of how do you measure this, right? Of course, it's anything but simple to measure these concepts, but let's get started on that. How do you measure, right? So we got a lot going on this slide, and let me just simplify this so that we can think about two, I kind of want to say competing approaches, because they are different. We can call them different, we can call them competing, but we have kind of the side where I'm in the empirical application side. So in other words, when I think about host community responses, procedural justice, distributive justice, I think about who are we going to interview in terms of they are in a host community, they live near a wind farm, right? And that, again, that's a flexible definition of what near means, but I'm interested in those people responding to this wind farm. And then my next challenge is, how do I translate the theoretical concepts of procedural and distributive justice into variables that we can then phrase as questions to obtain data or obtain some kind of response, I should say, from respondents. And knowing, however, that we don't just kind of develop that survey, but we conduct qualitative research to understand how can we better translate these theoretical concepts into variables. We will then deploy a survey instrument that has fixed and open-ended questions. Normally, Many of these are 5-point Likert scales with agree, disagree as extremes, and others in between. And we will talk to respondents about this wind farm, right? And that is the critical difference between, say, the empirical application and what we can call the vignette, or in technical terms, factorial survey experiment or discrete choice applications, which are really, really interesting. They just are not something that I have done. And what we've seen in the past few years is that there are two distinct approaches to this. So with the vignette approach, what we see are that people are sampled sometimes from a nationally representative population. So you are interested, so it's a different sampling approach, or it can be a different sampling approach. It can also use location criteria, like, you know, near a wind farm. And but the next step becomes different, right? And that is that the researchers are interested in developing vignettes or choices. So in other words, they'll construct kind of hypothetical wind farms and hypothetical situations that respondents will then agree or disagree with, or will rank on a fairness to unfairness scale. So they're not talking about this wind farm, they're talking about a hypothetical wind farm that could include different combinations of size, of height, of proximity to community, of community ownership, of process, of distribution of royalties, right? We can include a lot of these measures of distributional and procedural justice within these vignettes or choices. Now, I suppose one of the problems I have with this, especially applying it in a kind of a global South context, like these wind farms and communities where I've been working in Brazil, is that we end up offering hypothetical scenarios to people who might think that these are real scenarios. And so I think that that we raise the possibility of creating of offering a hypothetical situation in a research setting that could be interpreted by respondents as being a real possibility. So, you know, we end up kind of inflating expectations and putting researchers in a position of kind of a complicated position where, well, no, this is a hypothetical wind farm, but I'm asking you to evaluate it. So this may be kind of the vignette approach may work very well where you have people with, say, higher educational attainment, perhaps less economically marginalized, but I have a hard time thinking about how that would work in some of these coastal communities in Brazil. To their credit, the vignette experiment, people have very good claims to make for how it reduces what's called the social response bias. In other words, one of our problems with empirical application is that sometimes people tell you what you want to hear, or at least that's a possible bias, and the vignette survey approach will reduce that. All right, so hopefully that's not a kind of just a distraction to the overall thing, but I think it's important for especially the master's students to know that we have a couple of different ways of studying or trying to measure these things. I'm trying to click and I'm just getting a round circle here. Eventually I'll get to my next slide. So you see the spinning blue thing. So anyway, some references too on the bottom in case anyone's interested in following up on these two different approaches. And of course, I'm firmly in what we'll see going forward here is the empirical application as soon as the blue circle stops spinning. There we go. That didn't take that long. So one of the processes that we use is to think about these theoretical concepts or constructs, procedural justice, distributional, and so forth, and think about what is that question that we're going to ask. What is the variable that we're going to try to observe? So normally how this works is that in the literature so far is procedural justice is translated into these kinds of issues, right? These kinds of questions. So we're asking people, can you rate or rank the transparency? Give us so we'll ask people, the project developer was transparent. Do you strongly agree, disagree, or strongly disagree, or are you neutral on that? And we'll ask those kinds of questions about some distributional justice concepts and constructs, and we'll have a similar approach to what does wind power support mean. I suppose the kind of the theory behind this is that we're only getting to an observed or measured variable as a kind of a smaller thing than the theoretical construct, and get into the particular Brazilian case. Well, so we got a vast country, over 200 million people, highly reliant on hydropower for a while, and we see wind power start to make big inroads after a 2001 electricity blackout crisis that had big political implications and put the government on a track to provide information to firms, auctions, licensing, subsidies, and so forth. So a series of investors, of incentives for wind investors and for our local and regional elites. What we see that is notably different compared to some countries in Europe and even in Canada is we did not see community wind, right? So what we have here in Brazil are investor-driven investments that without cooperatives or joint ventures or community ownership. I'll be focusing on Ceará in the northeast of Brazil, where there is a special compatibility between when the wind resource is at its height compared to when the hydropower resource is at its lowest. So there is quite a bit to say in the sense of this compatibility in the Northeast. And the Northeast, in turn, has become an emerging cluster for wind power in Brazil. Now, when we look broadly at wind power in the Northeast of Brazil, and we think about that land dimension and the host community issue, we ran into some pretty interesting challenges that probably will not surprise those of you with any kind of background in Brazil. And it won't be a surprise to know that land tenure matters. And kind of, Brazil's, say, second sin, the first one being slavery, the second one is the inability of the state to create any kind of secure land tenure structure that would provide a strong legal foundation for marginalized people, right? So there are thousands of traditional communities, artisanal fishing, communal grazing lands, and so forth, who lack land tenure security. We have a land tenure system in Brazil that is fraught with systemic problems. There are Afro-Brazilian communities known as quilombolas that have insecure land tenure. We have indigenous groups with or without demarcated territories. We have conservation units that are run by municipal, state, and federal government, sometimes with strongly well-demarcated territories and other times without. And we have some really significant power and information asymmetries in a country that is, again, highly unequal, with rather large educational attainment disparities. So it is an interesting question to think about how siting decisions look in a context of traditional communities, land tenure insecurity, and so forth. So that this map on the left side of my screen, showing wind potential with some bright kind of blues and reds where it's highest on the coast, and some transmission lines. From a social perspective, this is kind of a fiction because it lacks any kind of overlay in terms of our land tenure problems, of quilombolas, of traditional communities, and so forth. So in some ways, this kind of map is, of course, this is what the Brazilian state did, was to provide these kinds of data to potential investors, almost kind of saying, well, you know, this can be yours, right? This is a wind resource that your wind turbines can capture and turn into electrons and, of course, capital. Ignoring the very complicated social reality that obviously can't be seen on a map like this in terms of the land tenure complexity, the information and power asymmetries, and the power of local and regional elites. So in that context, I started working with Brazilian colleagues for a while ago, a few years ago, and some of our findings to date have been strongly qualitative. We've been interested in, we've done some work on some of the, on illuminating some of the corrupt processes involved in licensing wind farms and kind of documenting how the licensing process helps to make communities invisible, right? So it's hard to think about procedural distributional justice if the host community is not even there, right? Because they've been literally erased from the maps that are included in the licensing documents. We've seen in some cases how even though we haven't applied procedural distributional justice concepts, we can see that the way people in host communities understand and frame support and opposition is largely within those two big domains in terms of the process of decision making and the harms and benefits of the wind farm. We've seen in our qualitative research, we've seen very little prior consultation and a very low level of economic benefit. We've seen a case of a quilombola community, right? These are these Afro-Brazilian communities that have lived largely on the fringes of society. We've seen in one case where this group kind of combined opposition to a wind farm with their identity and now are involved in a pretty complex land dispute, right? So you might, if you know Brazil, you're like, well, okay, surprise, you've got a big infrastructure in rural areas. You are going to have land tenure be at the core or at the center of the kinds of disputes that may arise, right? So again, no surprise really in terms of that, but we had very little qualitative data on this before we got started. The next step, however, is to push the research into a more quantitative aspect to perhaps generalize more, right? And to think about causal factors in a more rigorous quantitative sense. So what we did was define 3 host communities, right? These are the 3 on the left map of Ceará, Amarelos, Patos, and Maceió. These were in this emerging cluster of wind farms. We did not select these randomly, but rather we selected these because the research was viable in these places. In other words, the research team had some prior contact with leaders, or the leaders showed that they were receptive to basically a group of geography students, descending on the community and asking questions in a survey format. We conducted some focus groups first to try to understand a little bit better some of the issues involved. In one case, Amarelas on the far west of Ceará's coast, where there had been extensive prior research that had been conducted, a lot of extension work well before I got involved in the project. So that was a natural good fit. And then we developed contacts in these other 2 sites. We followed the standard process of understanding the justice constructs, of developing the survey, of training the enumerators, right, who were geography students at the university in Fortaleza. And I think the innovation here, what we're doing that's, again, well different from the qualitative work we had done in the past, is that we now are operating in a fully quantitative mode, where the end of this will be binary logistic regression models and odds ratios so that we can identify the variables that increase or decrease the odds of supporting wind farms. And in that regard, we're following some recent work in the literature by Firestone and others that have used some very similar methods, but in research design, but in Eastern United States and in Eastern Canada. So to our knowledge, this is perhaps the first study that tries to do that, to deploy that kind of survey design in a developing country or a global south context. So a little bit more on the three communities. We have one called Amarelas that in turn has three sub-communities. The wind farm here was built on the dunes. It was one of the earlier wind farms to be built. And this is the case where one of the sub-communities was made invisible through the planning process. And part of that, of those reivindications ended up with the wind company, the investors providing enough money to build 20 houses that would replace these kind of wattle and daub houses. And here our question, we knew that there was some initial opposition to the wind farm. And we're here, so our sub question here was, is opposition general or is it lasting? We're also in Maceió, where we don't have a wind farm built, right? It was planned, and the licensing since has been abandoned. But at the time of the survey, the wind farm was under consideration. It was under review by the licensing agencies. This community in particular has quite a history in terms of the land struggle. Right, so this is again not atypical. We have, in Brazil's kind of land tenure dimension, we have many, literally thousands of communities that are in some kind of struggle. And so this was a community that had kind of secured its land claims after a long period of struggle with defending their claims from fraudsters and speculators. And they're also, this is important, they're also linked to what's known as the MST in Brazil, or the landless workers movement, which arguably was Latin America's most important and influential social movement for in the 1990s and the first part of this decade as well. So they are well mobilized politically, and I'll just point to a couple of indications of that. Right, they maintain an encampment 24/7 on land that is claimed by speculators, and they call it our land. So the sign below says "Welcome to Camp Our Land" as a way that, marking their defensive territory. And they have been involved in meetings and groups that promote a view that wind farms are dangerous to host communities. And that's this poster on the upper left, which is was something organized in 2012 when you just want to note the iconography of the wind farm, of the wind turbines seem to be kind of about to overtake and destroy a simple community, right? So that's so they're well articulated, well involved politically into a movement against wind. So here our sub question is more: is the opposition of some community leaders, is it generalized or is it limited to a vocal group of well mobilized community leaders? Then we have our third site, Patos, was where a wind farm was built much more recently than in Amarelas, 2017. And here we have a similar land struggle, but very different in that it was linked to the state agencies rather than the MST, and that matters in Brazil. From the outside, it's a land struggle, we have fine, but in terms of how it's politically connected, it's very, very different. And here we have the case where the investors, a large company known as CPFL, which actually started as a São Paulo company to provide power, has since expanded nationally and is now a big, some part of it is owned by Chinese capital. But anyway, they built a bridge, they paid some debt that one of these associations owed for its land tenure struggle, and they helped to renovate a processing plant for manioc or yucca, cassava. And the wind farms are sited on some of the lands that were obtained through the land struggle. And that in turn helps generate royalties the groups that are part of the agrarian reform movement here. So this is very different. We don't have too many reports of this, but we do know that that wind farms are sited on lands that people own. So this became another good site to use. So here our sub-question was, is the support of one organization generalized across the community? So now I know we're at a very late moment in the, we should be on questions and discussion now, but because of the double failure, we'll have to go real quickly into some data, some educational attainment data. This is of course a place where, we're about 20 to 30% of respondents have either only literacy or no formal education, where fishing and agriculture are highly important, right? This is part of the traditional community profile in coastal Brazil. And notably, we have very strong measures of attachment to the community, where upwards of 90% of respondents are telling us this is a good place to live, and strong majorities are telling us that I'm not interested in living somewhere else, right? I'm perfectly happy in my community. Some of the findings in terms of the wind farm support, right? So I suppose not surprisingly, Maceió, the community where we have a well-mobilized agrarian reform leadership that's well connected with a left of center social movement, and had long opposed large-scale electricity infrastructure on their lands. They show very little support, whereas in Amarelas and Patos, we have very strong measures of support. Notably, the support goes down when we start to ask about more wind turbines, but remain high when we think about, do you support wind farms in the state? Do you support wind farm for Brazil's energy needs? We have some data here on the distributional justice variables that we have Amarelas and Patos with very high figures on the notion of benefits, and not concerned about the potential ugliness of wind farms, but in fact are strongly supportive of a statement that says, wind farms are beautiful on the landscape. Right, those become very high indeed. On the employment side, we ask also questions about that, and we'll just notice that Maceió is always far lower on some of these measures of distributional justice, where the benefits are lower, the generation of employment is lower, and the question on improving the community is also considerably less. Right, some questions on the on the procedural justice, right? And here where we see some really low measures of a transparent consultation process for Amarelas, weak measures on information, which are even worse. In Maceió, people have thought that the process was fraught with corruption, that they weren't getting the right information, that the company didn't clarify doubts and so forth. And we'll notice that in Patos, we have very, very different findings, right? Where the respondents were much more favorable to questions such as the information was reliable, the community was consulted, and the consultation process was transparent. Right, so now to the logistic regression, where we see, I think, strong findings in terms of benefits, right? So there's a long story I could get into about how we transform those variables into what's benefits community and so forth, but we don't have time at this late hour in our 11 o'clock period. But notably benefits and consultation, right? So procedural justice in the case of Amarelas, and distributional justice in the cases of Maceió and Patos. So strongly in line with the literature, but just to say, well, what does this actually mean, right? So this means that in the case of Amarelas, for example, the odds of support increase by 12.6, or when the consultation variable increases by 1. And in Patos and Maceió, we have also very strong, even stronger for Maceió, odds of increased support when the benefits variable increases by 1. We did this for the other dependent variables regarding support, but we don't. But I'm not doing this here. And even if I tried, I wouldn't have time. The full paper, of course, gets into that. But to kind of to start to wrap this up a little bit more, is this takes us to the notion of what benefits means in the cases of these traditional fishing agriculture communities in the northeast of Brazil. And it is about, we think is about livelihood improvement and employment. We think that what we're hearing from the respondents in Patos is that however, is how the benefits part is tightly interwoven with the consultation part. So the data don't quite show that, but what we know that the benefits part is very, very strong, but we'll also note that the only reason that there are benefits in Patos is because they achieve them through negotiation or consultation. All right, so the benefits don't just materialize out of thin air, but they're a product of discussion, negotiation, information exchange, and so forth. In Maceió, we see really strong rejection of the wind farm. Not a surprise. It is a little surprising on how widespread that was, that it was not limited to just, the mobilized leadership of the community, but fairly widespread. But we also know that the benefits, that if a respondent's perceived benefits from the wind farm, they have much higher odds of supporting the wind farm. And that's, again, suggesting the belief in economic opportunities from wind in terms of employment or a general notion of benefits. Getting to the consultation, like what does consultation mean in the context of information asymmetries, low educational attainment, and so forth. So we have really low indicators of procedural justice in Amarelas, but there is a high and significant odds ratio suggesting that the community would, if perhaps had stronger measures of procedural justice been used, we could have had even stronger measures of the support. So what we noticed also is that the support was higher than we expected given our qualitative research. So our qualitative research, perhaps not surprisingly, had focused on cases of conflict. And when we go back and we deploy the survey instrument and using probability sampling and so forth, we find that our support is much higher in Amarelas than we had thought from the qualitative work, in part because time had elapsed. The wind farm investors had provided funds for the new houses and so forth. And in a place like Patos, we see that there are several initiatives that the wind farm invested in or applied, and that those are about strengthening livelihoods. They're not, there are many ways for wind farms to operate in these host communities, these traditional communities. And I think the Patos case shows that when they are aimed at strengthening livelihoods, manioc processing, a bridge so people can move back and forth, royalties that they can use to invest in their farms, that matters a lot. And I think in more general terms, when we compare this to Europe and North America, we see that our findings are similar in many ways to the reports of other scholars showing the importance of procedural and distributional justice in explaining the support. Perhaps unlike some of those studies, we see even lower concern for aesthetics, and we see discomfort and environment not being terribly helpful in explaining support. There's a few things that we could have done a little differently, but I think I'll end with the very last item here, and that we still are, I think, as a field of social scientists who study host community responses, we still are struggling for a kind of a cross-cultural survey instrument that would reduce kind of the wide variation we have in the different survey instruments that are often being applied, in North America, in Europe, now in Brazil, and so eventually it would be nice to get to a point where we're asking the same question and construct in a way that is truly comparable in spite of the very big differences among host communities. And so just to end you, to leave you with this one here. So adding the social dimension to these grand challenges, I think this tries to sum this up, and that we have strong rejection in one community that we can explain through a land conflict and some distributional justice variables, and strong acceptance in a couple of other places, one that is explained by distributional justice and another by procedural justice variables. So I think, Valentini, I need to stop here. Again, apologies for that double failure on the technology side.